Some stories don't begin with a headline, they begin with silence. Harrison Ford hadn't worn his flight jacket in years, but one quiet morning in Wyoming, he found a letter folded beneath it. Just a name on the envelope, no return address, no explanation, only 4 words in handwriting he recognized instantly: to Captain Ford, with regret, and that was enough. Enough to bring back the face of a young man who never got to speak for himself. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you believe silence sometimes says more than words, don't forget to subscribe. It was supposed to be a light segment, a bit of comic relief in a serious discussion about military leadership. The set was polished, the lighting tight, and the cameras moved with practiced rhythm. At center stage, Donald Trump adjusted his mic. Already halfway through a story the audience was eager to laugh at, because he had told it before. And every time it landed. "We were at this air base," he began, smirking as if the punchline had already arrived. "Middle of nowhere, real Top Gun stuff. Helicopters, rescue birds, the whole dramatic American thing. Beautiful day, cameras out, Melania looking like she just walked off a Vogue shoot. So I said, hey, let's get a shot by the hangars." The crowd chuckled. Studio laughter always had that polished sound, half real, half rehearsed. Trump leaned forward like a man about to deliver a monologue he'd crafted a dozen times. "She walks over, right, just a little past the clearance line, and there's this guy, this kid, in full gear, pilot uniform, standing there like a prop, doesn't salute, doesn't speak, doesn't move, just stares straight ahead like someone hit pause on his brain." Laughter, real now, big. Someone clapped too loudly from the second row. The moderator, Julia, smiled tightly and shifted in her seat. She knew where this story was going, so did half the room. Trump mimed the moment. "I step forward very politely, very presidential, and I say, excuse me, the First Lady needs to pass. And this kid, he just nothing, not a blink, like I'm the invisible man." The audience cracked open again. Trump was animated now, turning toward the camera, feeding off the sound. It's like he was guarding the nuclear codes with his stare. "I said to myself, wow, we're building robots now, huh?" More laughter. A few people tilted back in their chairs. Someone wiped a tear from their eye, though it was unclear if it was from humor or second-hand embarrassment. What the camera hadn't caught yet, or hadn't decided to show, was the man sitting 2 spots down from the moderator. He hadn't moved, hadn't laughed. His hands rested on the table in front of him, fingers loosely clasped. His head was slightly bowed, the brim of a dark cap casting a shadow over his eyes. The nameplate in front of him read H. Ford. Most people in the audience hadn't even noticed it yet. Harrison Ford. No special intro, no cutaway shot, just presence, quiet, solid, still. As Trump continued to mock the young pilot, the guy had one job: look sharp and move smart, but he just stood there like a mannequin missing a brainstem. The camera began a slow pan, not fast, not obvious, just a creeping shift, frame by frame, until the edges of Ford's silhouette entered the shot. Didn't blink, didn't flinch, just sat there, left hand resting on the table, right hand slowly reaching toward his jaw, the tip of his index finger brushing the scar along his chin. A scar he never spoke about publicly, but it was always there. A reminder from a crash decades ago, a plane he flew himself, a moment where life didn't offer a second take. The laughter kept going. It hadn't noticed the silence beside it yet. Trump leaned back, pleased with the rhythm. "I mean, I respect protocol, don't get me wrong. But if the First Lady's trying to cross a line for a photo op, maybe use your head, right? Smile, nod, adapt. That's leadership too, not just standing there like you're guarding Area 51. Another round of laughter, not as loud this time. The moderator glanced at her cue cards. Someone near the sound booth glanced toward camera 2, the one now fully capturing Ford's profile. Still, he didn't speak. That's the thing about silence. Sometimes it's just absence, but sometimes it's something else, something held, something sharp. The kind of silence that carries weight because it's not empty, it's waiting. What the audience didn't know, what even Trump didn't know, was that the robotic pilot in his story wasn't just another nameless recruit. He had a name, Taylor Bryant. And years ago, long before that moment at the air base, he had trained under one man. That man was now sitting just 20 feet away, in a dark flannel shirt, an old leather jacket, his voice quiet, his hands still, but his memory alive. And he hadn't come here to speak, but he had heard enough. He didn't blink, Trump said, chuckling as he turned to the audience. "I mean, not once. I've seen mannequins with more emotional range. Guy stood there like DARPA coded him from scratch. Maybe someone should check if he had a USB port in the back of his neck." Laughter rippled again, but this time it was thinner, a little more forced. The kind of laughter that comes when you think you're supposed to laugh, Julia, the moderator, shifted in her seat, fingers hovering near her tablet as if ready to move the discussion along. She cleared her throat almost imperceptibly. Trump didn't notice or chose not to. I asked him, Trump continued, his voice louder now. I said, "Do you even recognize who you're standing in front of?" And he just stared. No salute, no words, nothing, like I was part of the wallpaper. This time the laughter that came was disjointed. A few chuckles here and there, one nervous laugh from someone off camera, but the energy had changed. The camera operator knew it. So did camera 2, the one now slowly pushing in on the far-right panelist. Harrison Ford still hadn't moved, but the light above him had shifted slightly, casting a soft gleam across the weathered leather of his jacket. His head was tilted just enough for the brim of his cap to keep his eyes shaded. But you didn't need to see his eyes to feel where he was looking. Not at the panel, not at Trump, not even at Julia. Somewhere past the audience, somewhere behind the stage, somewhere only he could see. His left hand rested on the table, knuckles bent slightly inward. Then slowly he closed it, not in a fist, not in anger. Just folded it gently, as if feeling the shape of something invisible in his palm. From the right breast pocket of his jacket, a corner of something yellowed began to show. Paper, folded in thirds, creased along the edge like it had been carried more than once. Not recent, not planned. The paper didn't fall out. It revealed itself. Julia tried again. "Mr. President," she said, voice firm but polite, "perhaps we could." But Trump raised a hand. "No, no. This is important," he said, waving off her interruption. "This story says everything about what's wrong with training these days. Discipline without discretion. Orders without thought. You give a kid a uniform and a rulebook, and suddenly he thinks he's guarding nuclear launch codes." The audience didn't laugh this time. Not really. Someone coughed. Someone else adjusted their mic. And Harrison still hadn't said a word. But his silence had weight now, not passive, not reluctant. It was the kind of silence that gathers, slow and deliberate, like weather forming on the edge of a radar. He wasn't preparing to speak, not yet. But the decision to remain silent was no longer neutral. Trump kept going. "You can't just freeze every time a sign says restricted. You've got to think. That's what leadership is. Flexibility, judgment, not just following orders like some automaton." A beat passed, then another, and still Ford sat unmoving, but his right index finger now tapped once against the rim of his glass, just once. No rhythm, just a contact, glass on skin, a pulse. Enough to register that he was listening, that he was recording. Julia looked toward the booth. A producer behind the glass made eye contact and slowly gave a nod. The feed was hot. The camera was locked in. The story was shifting. What no one knew, what even Trump didn't realize, was that every word, every insult, every punchline was falling not into a void, but into a memory, a lived moment. A protocol followed, a decision made. One that Harrison Ford had seen unfold from the air, from the ground, and later from the aftermath. He didn't look angry. He didn't look amused. He looked like a man staring through a wall no one else could see, and behind that wall something waited. Trump leaned back in his chair, grinning like a man who had just landed the final blow in a long-running joke. He held for effect, letting the moment breathe, then said it. "What was his name again?" "The statue kid." "Ah, Taylor Bryant." "Yeah, looked like he was guarding the White House from me personally." The laughter came, but it was late, slower, uneven, like a machine stalling on its last gear. A few scattered chuckles, a cough somewhere near the second row. One man laughed too loudly, then immediately stopped, unsure if the room was still with him. That was the moment Harrison Ford lifted his head. Not fast, not dramatic, just a steady tilt upward. The brim of his cap no longer shadowed his face. His eyes were visible now, not angry, not glassy, just focused like a man watching a lever move closer to its breaking point. Julia noticed the shift and turned slightly toward him. She didn't speak, not yet, but the question was there in her eyes. Would he respond? Would he diffuse it or detonate it? Ford didn't meet her gaze. He didn't nod, didn't gesture. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his leather jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It was aged, creased along the seams like it had been read and folded and read again more times than it was ever meant to be. No label, no signature on the outside, just weight, the kind of document that carries more than ink. He placed it on the table gently, not to show it off, but as if setting something down that had been too heavy to carry any longer. The camera zoomed in without being told. Instinct, maybe, or maybe something else. Maybe it knew the air had changed. Ford unfolded the paper slowly. 3 folds, 1 center crease, 2 side wings. Then he read, voice low, clear, unhurried. Incident report. Rescue Corridor Z, March 18, 2021. Pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Taylor J. Bryant. Location, Pine Ridge Base. Status: Red Corridor Lockdown. High security protocol initiated due to active equipment transfer from DARPA division. Violation: None. The room didn't make a sound. Trump's grin faltered just slightly. He adjusted his cufflink, looked to the moderator, then back to Ford. But Ford wasn't done. Summary, he continued, tone unchanged. Subject remained at post during temporary lockdown initiated by base command. Denied access to unauthorized personnel per Code 721B. Did not engage, did not deviate from assigned task. He folded the paper once, then let it rest on the table again. His hand stayed on top of it, flat and firm. The silence wasn't awkward, it was surgical. Julia finally spoke, her voice softer than before. Mr. Ford, is this connected to the incident the president described? Ford still didn't look at her. His eyes were steady on the paper, or maybe on what it used to mean. He was my student, Ford said, simple, flat. But in those 4 words, something cracked open. Trump blinked. Ford went on, voice measured, every syllable like a footstep through memory. In 2020, I assisted the emergency rescue training program at Pine Ridge. Temporary assignment, volunteer role. They asked me to help shape new protocols for non-combat response zones. Taylor Bryant was in that first group. He was 22, quiet, focused, fast learner. He paused. Out of 62 trainees, he was one of 3 who completed the high-pressure lockdown simulation without a single procedural failure. Another pause. And the only one I ever personally selected to lead a real-time rescue during simulation blackout. The camera moved in closer, almost reverently. Ford turned slightly now, just enough to look toward Trump. Not glaring, not confronting, just seeing. He wasn't frozen. He wasn't confused. He was following orders, not mine, the base commander's. Orders written for situations where emotion is not the correct response. Trump opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Ford didn't give him the space to recover. Red corridor protocols are used during high-sensitivity equipment transfers, DARPA-grade systems. That day, Rescue Corridor Z was locked down under temporary clearance freeze. No passage, no exceptions, not even for media, not even for the First Lady. His hand lifted from the paper now, but only to tap it once, gently, with 2 fingers. Did exactly what we trained him to do. There was no applause, no reaction, only a sudden and heavy realization that this wasn't a story anymore. It never had been. The studio lights didn't shift, but something else had. The air felt heavier now, like the room was suddenly aware of its own breathing. Harrison Ford sat still for a long moment after finishing the report. His fingers rested gently on the folded paper, as if even that contact required care. He spoke again. Slower this time. Pine Ridge Air Base, he said, 2020. I was asked to consult for a 6-week disaster readiness course. They were redesigning training protocols for non-combat emergencies, rescue operations, humanitarian response, wildfire evacuations. It wasn't combat, but it required discipline. He paused, not for effect, for memory. Taylor Bryant showed up on day 2, 23 years old, Colorado kid. Never raised his voice, never had to. The kind of young man who didn't need praise to keep going, he just needed a reason. Ford's voice stayed low, but something inside it started to bend. He wasn't the fastest, wasn't the strongest, but he could fly, I mean fly. That first week, we did a simulated canyon lift over Montana-style terrain. His co-pilot froze mid-drill. Taylor rerouted, took control, and completed the evac solo. 4 civilians extracted in under 8 minutes. No errors, no panic. A few heads in the audience nodded. No one smiled. Ford continued. He didn't brag about it, barely acknowledged it. Just asked if he could run the scenario again, this time with a wind speed handicap. Said he wanted to feel the weight of the blades in headwind. That's when I started paying attention. The screen behind the panel slowly shifted to a blurred image, file photo not staged, of a young man in flight gear beside a black rescue chopper. No name tag visible. Just the look of someone focused, boots still dusty, helmet tucked under one arm. Ford didn't look at the image. He didn't need to. He closed his eyes for a breath, then opened them. The day the First Lady visited, the base was running a red zone lockdown. That's a high-security perimeter for sensitive transport, classified systems, high-risk equipment, sometimes even intel briefcases. On that day, they were moving DARPA-grade tech through Rescue Corridor Z. Half the base was sealed off under protocol. He turned his head, just slightly, scanning the faces around him, not to accuse, but to measure whether they were still listening. The order was clear. Ford said, no exceptions, no passage, not for media, not for guests, not for staff, not for rank. He looked directly at Trump now, not even for the First Lady. Trump didn't respond. His jaw tensed, but his hands remained folded on the table. Ford leaned forward slightly, elbows resting near the edge of the desk, voice barely above a whisper now. Taylor was assigned to the corridor checkpoint that morning. His task was simple: stand post, deny access, engage no one unless protocol failed. That was the drill, that was the job. He let that sentence hang. He didn't move because he wasn't supposed to. He didn't speak because the protocol didn't allow him to. And he didn't blink because in that moment, blinking meant doubt. The room was frozen now. No jokes, no shifting chairs, just the sound of Ford's voice filling the quiet spaces. Do you know what happens when someone crosses a red corridor without clearance during a DARPA run? Ford asked the question flatly. The entire route gets resecured, routes rerouted, timing compromised, evac scenarios delayed, and if that happens during a real deployment, people don't make it. He tapped the paper once. He followed the order, no more, no less, and in doing so, he didn't disrespect the First Lady. He protected her. The sentence didn't echo. It didn't need to, because now the laughter they had shared minutes before sat in the room like a leftover fire, smoldering, awkward, misplaced. Ford straightened, not defensive, just steady. I've flown into wildfire zones where the smoke was so thick I couldn't see the horizon. I've landed on ridgelines where 5 degrees of tilt would have killed everyone on board. You know what keeps you alive out there? Procedure, not instinct, not charm. Procedure. He looked at the audience again. Not all of them met his gaze. Taylor Bryant was doing his job. That job was to protect the corridor. And whether she knew it or not, when she approached that red zone, he protected her too. He didn't say the punchline because there wasn't one. And in that silence, everyone felt it. Harrison Ford reached into his jacket again, this time slower, like the movement itself carried weight. The kind of weight that doesn't come from paper but from time, from silence, from memory. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed at the edges, creased. No seal, just a name handwritten in black ink across the front. To Captain Ford with regret. No one spoke, not on the panel, not in the audience, not even Trump. Ford held the envelope for a moment, just held it, as if part of him wasn't ready to open it, as if some part of him hoped the words inside had changed since the last time he read them. They hadn't. He unfolded the letter carefully, once, twice, 3 times, then he read, I followed everything you taught me, every protocol, every posture, every reason not to flinch. But I can't fly for a country that punishes silence and rewards mockery. That was the opening. The first sentence alone changed the temperature in the room. Ford didn't look up. He just kept reading, not as a performance, not for drama, just to give the words back to the world that forgot them. After the incident, I stayed. I took the jokes, the whispers, the cut edits and the viral clips. People laughing like I was some frozen idiot, like I didn't know the First Lady. I knew who she was. That's why I didn't move. He paused, not because he had to, but because the letter did. Then he continued. There's a moment in flight where you don't look at the sky, you don't look at the gauges, you just listen to the hum, to the pressure, to everything that could go wrong in the next 3 seconds. That moment is discipline. That's what I learned from you. Ford's voice didn't crack, it didn't rise, but something about it made the room feel smaller. He looked at the page again. But the world doesn't run on discipline, sir. It runs on narrative. And once mine was taken from me, once I became a joke, I couldn't get it back. He folded the letter once and placed it on the table in front of him. He didn't look at Trump. He looked down. He said, I got that letter a year after the segment first aired. The late-night shows had picked it up by then. YouTube thumbnails, edits with laugh tracks, TikToks with captions like most awkward soldier ever. And no one corrected it. No one explained the protocol, the zone. The risk, they just laughed. He breathed in, let it settle. Taylor submitted his resignation 2 weeks after the letter. He didn't go quietly. He went with full honors, but not because the system protected him, because the system let him leave. He looked up now, straight ahead. He said we didn't discharge him for misconduct. He followed every rule, but he didn't stay because we let his silence be repackaged as stupidity. We let his discipline become material for monologues. He reached toward the letter again, but he didn't pick it up, just tapped it once. I should have said this 3 years ago, before the edits, before the rally applause, before it became too late to change the way the story lived online. He paused. The First Lady never filed a complaint. The base never issued a reprimand, but none of that mattered. Because once a truth is bent into a joke, it stops being a fact and starts being a brand. He looked across the table now, not accusatory, not even angry, just tired, quietly tired. 3 others from that class left the force that year. He let that hang, not because of injury, not because of trauma, because they saw what happened to Taylor. and they knew silence wasn't just vulnerable, it was disposable. The audience didn't breathe. Not really. Ford leaned back slightly, his hands now resting flat on the table. I trained him to hold his post, to trust the mission, to let others speak while he stood still, but I never prepared him for what happens when silence becomes entertainment. He turned the letter one last time until the name at the top faced the audience. Taylor J. Bryant. Then he looked at the crowd. He's not sitting here. He's not on this stage. He's not trending. He's not defending himself on podcasts. He's flying crop dusters in a county with no press. He left quietly because we laughed too loudly. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that moment every sound felt wrong, even the quiet. Harrison Ford didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He just looked across the table, past the lights, past the panel, past the cameras, and into the face of the man who'd repeated the same story too many times to count. His eyes didn't accuse. They didn't challenge. They simply observed, and what they saw wasn't funny. You didn't need to name him, Ford said. His voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't bitter. It was what remained when disappointment had nowhere else to go. You didn't need to mock him. You didn't even need to believe him. You just needed silence. But you couldn't even give him that. Trump shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to adjust his tie, just enough to feel the temperature of the room sliding away from him. Ford continued. You had a platform, you had the crowd, you had the lights, and instead of leaving that moment where it belonged in privacy, in respect, you turned it into content. He glanced toward the booth. The producers, perhaps unsure whether to cut away, froze. Then, without warning, the screen behind the panel came alive. Clips, laughter, highlights, edited segments, one after another. 2022, a late-night interview, Trump laughing about the pilot who thought blinking would violate national security. 2023, a town hall in Houston. A crowd roaring at the joke about our newest robotic defense system, standing 6 feet tall and powered by absolute obedience. 2024, a campaign dinner, Trump standing behind a podium, arms outstretched, telling the story again, now condensed, tighter, sharper, crafted for the soundbite. Every time the punchline hit, every time the crowd laughed, and every time Taylor Bryant didn't get to speak, Ford said nothing as the clips played. He didn't need to. The timeline did the talking. So did the silence that followed when the screen finally went dark again. The joke worked, Ford said quietly, not because it was clever, not because it was true. It worked because no one stopped you. No one challenged the story, not the host, not the audience, not the camera crew. We all let it grow. He looked at the audience now, not with blame, but with clarity. Taylor wasn't broken by a mistake. He wasn't reprimanded for disobedience. He was dismantled piece by piece in every retelling until he was no longer a person. Just a punchline, a meme, a reference. He didn't flinch, and that made him strange. He didn't speak, and that made him dull. He didn't step aside, and that made him wrong. And none of it had to be true, not to be shared. He picked up the letter again but didn't read from it. He just held it. There's this thing we do, he said. When we see someone hold the line, we test it. We push it. We see if they'll bend, and when they don't, we call them inflexible. We call them outdated. But maybe the problem isn't the line. Maybe it's that we've forgotten what it was protecting. He paused. No one moved. Taylor didn't break because of what you said once. He broke because we let you say it again, and again, and again, until the story was yours, not his. And the silence he was trained to hold became the very thing used against him. He wasn't angry. His voice didn't rise. But the words landed heavier than anything shouted could have. We ask for discipline, Ford said. Then we punish it for not entertaining us. We ask for order, then mock the people who follow it too well. We train them to be still under pressure and then humiliate them for doing exactly that. He leaned back slightly, the envelope still in his hand. That wasn't just a story you told. It was a removal, a quiet erasure, and we all watched it happen. He looked down at the table now, not because he was done, but because something inside him had already been said. The rest was just the weight of letting the room feel it. Harrison Ford stood up. No signal, no cue, no swell of music or camera tilt to announce the movement. He simply rose, steady and unhurried, like a man who had carried something long enough. No one stopped him. No one tried. The envelope stayed on the table, unclaimed, unoffered. It didn't point toward Trump. It wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary. A line drawn not in anger, but in finality. Ford looked down at it once more, then back at the room. He didn't flinch because I taught him not to, he said, not when it counted. The sentence didn't echo. It landed. Some truths don't need amplification, just space. He didn't look at Trump when he said it. He didn't need to. The story didn't belong to the man who told it too many times. It belonged to the one who never got to. Ford turned toward the edge of the stage. he took a few steps, the kind of steps that weren't rushed, that didn't ask for applause or permission, that simply moved forward because something had been said and there was nothing left to hold. He reached the edge of the light. The glow caught the back of his jacket, the creases, the wear, the quiet proof of a life lived off-script. Then he stopped, one hand at his side, one breath between movements. He turned his head just slightly enough for the room to see his profile again. "We laugh at discipline," he said, "then wonder why no one's left standing when crisis comes." The silence that followed wasn't shocked. It was ashamed. He didn't say goodbye, didn't offer a closing thought. He didn't have to, because this was never about redemption. It wasn't about reclaiming a narrative or confronting a political moment. It was about a single name on a letter that never should have needed writing. Taylor J. Bryant. Ford stepped off stage. No applause, no outro, just the sound of a man walking away from a table that had finally been made to listen. And for the first time since the story began, the spotlight didn't follow the man who told the joke. It stayed on the envelope and the space around it. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.